In the early 90s, the state of Oregon was swept by a wave of terrible crimes. The police often received reports of attacks on women. For several years, these crimes remained unsolved until one accident helped to detain the one who kept the state in fear all this time. On October 9, 1992, at 3 a.m., Hillsborough police received a call from a woman living on Cornell Road. She was woken up by the sound of multiple shots. When the patrol arrived at the scene, they found a Volkswagen car that had driven onto a pedestrian sidewalk. The car was riddled with bullets. Later, forensics will count 17 holes. The front seat was covered in blood. On it lay a woman's handbag and pieces of glass. In the glove compartment, the patrol found documents in the name of 41-year-old Martha Bryant, and her license was in her purse. When examining the scene, more than a dozen shell casings were found on the ground. About half an hour later, the police received another call. At 321st Street, about half a mile from the found car, a woman was lying on the sidewalk, bleeding. She turned out to be Marta, who was still alive, but she died in the hospital a few hours later. During the autopsy, it was found that Marta had been beaten and raped. She was also shot. One 9mm bullet was removed from the lung, and the second .22 caliber bullet was removed from the head. After a series of examinations, it turned out that the car was shot while it was moving. One of the bullets went through the door of the car and pierced Martha's lung. She was later fatally shot at point-blank range in the temple. Experts suggested that there were two shooters. Martha worked as an obstetrician-gynecologist and often stayed at work until the morning, when she had to take delivery. The police interviewed all her acquaintances and colleagues and came to the conclusion that the woman had no enemies, as well as a motive for killing her. During the investigation, the police reached a dead end, so it was decided to seek help from Detective Michael O'Connell. He suggested that Martha's case might have something in common with another unsolved crime that had been committed earlier in the same city. On April 19, 1991, the body of 62-year-old Margaret Schmidt was discovered in her own home. The woman was raped and strangled. The only evidence was an 8.5-inch Reebok shoe. It was found on scattered talc. Margaret lived alone, but neighbor periodically visited her. It's this neighbor discovered the Margaret's body. Margaret led a quiet life, had no enemies. Strangers, including on the eve of the murder, did not come to her house. Comparing the cases of Martha and Margaret, the detective came to the conclusion that they are completely different. 3 months later, another murder occurred. On December 30, a girl's body was found on the side of Highway 26 near Hillsborough. The medical examiner determined that she had been severely beaten, raped, and shot in the chin from a pistol .22 gauge. The girl had no documents, so the detectives decided to identify her by fingerprints. The victim was 23-year-old Shanti Woodman from Portland. A few years ago, she was charged with a minor offense. The police interviewed Shanti's friends, but no one was able to provide any useful information. Detectives speculated that Shanti and Martha may have been shot with the same .22 caliber weapon. But after a ballistic examination of the bullets extracted from the bodies, it turned out that they were fired from different pistols. Now the police had 3 cold cases that were not connected. To deal with them, Washington County officials organized a focus group consisting of officers and local law enforcement. They reviewed hundreds of versions but made little progress. In February, the police again received disturbing calls. This time it was the victims themselves. They were elderly women living in Hillsborough, not far from each other. One of them, 58-year-old Matilda Gardner, recognized the man who attacked her. It turned out to be 30-year-old Cesar Barone. Matilda was the owner of an apartment building that she rented out, and Cesar lived there until recently. He came to the woman's house and asked to use the phone. When she let him into the apartment, he attacked her. Luckily, Matilda had an alarm key fob in her hand, and when she pressed the button, Cesar ran out of the apartment. Later, another woman also identified Cesar Barone. The police got a warrant for his arrest. Finding Cesar was not difficult. He was quickly tracked down and detained at a local bar. Detective O'Connell began to make inquiries about the suspect and found out that he had a rich criminal past. But in order to hide the truth about himself, after many years in prison, Cesar changed name. Once Cesar Francesco Barone was called Adolph James Rode. He was born December 4, 1960 in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. The family called him Jimmy. The boy grew up with his older brother Rick and sister Debbie. Jimmy, as the youngest child, received a lot of attention. He grew up in love and care, was very active and inquisitive. Jimmy's behavior began to change after his parents divorced. He was 4 years old when his mother decided to leave the family for another man. She left the children to her ex-husband, Adolph Sar. The man was very difficult. He tried to provide the family with everything necessary, and there was practically no time left for raising children. Rick and Debbie were old enough to understand what was going on, unlike Jimmy. The departure of his mother from the family had a negative impact on his behavior. He became capricious and disobedient. Soon, Adolph Sar began a relationship with Stella Hall, who began to help him with the children and treated them as if they were her own. After 2 years, the couple got married. Stella had an excellent relationship with older children, but Jimmy stubbornly refused to accept her. Although the woman tried to give him as much attention as possible to compensate for the absence of her mother. With age, Jimmy's behavior only worsened. In kindergarten, he often offended children and stole toys from them. The teachers could not cope with the boy, and he was expelled from the kindergarten. Stella began to suspect that Jimmy had a mental disorder. She shared her concerns with her husband and offered to take him to a psychologist. But Adolph believed that the boy had no problems. He justified Jimmy's bad behavior with age and hyperactivity. Adolph believed that his son should be given more attention and enrolled in sports sections. With the exception of Jimmy's disciplinary problems, the life of the Rode family was going very well. Adolph took a management position in the company where he had previously worked as a carpenter and began to earn good money. Soon the family moved to a new house with a swimming pool in a prestigious area of the city. When Jimmy went to school, teachers began to call Stella often, complaining about his behavior. The woman had to deal with these problems herself because Adolph was completely absorbed in work. He needed not only to provide for his family, but also to pay off a loan for a new house. At the age of 10, Jimmy started smoking and drinking alcohol. He always carried knives with him, with which he threatened classmates. By the age of 13, Jimmy was completely out of control. It was impossible to influence his behavior. He did whatever he wanted. He constantly drank alcohol, used illegal substances, got into fights, and later began to terrorize neighbors. His favorite pastime was stealing the neighbors' pets, which he dealt with in cold blood. Jimmy also often affected women. He had undisguised contempt for them. Jimmy treated his stepmother just as badly. Stella constantly complained to her husband about his son, but Adolph believed that she was exaggerating and simply didn't like Jimmy. Once Stella's patience snapped and she divorced Adolph. Jimmy was happy about it. Now no one will report to his father about what he is doing. The lack of control completely untied the hands of Jimmy, and he began to do what he had long dreamed of. Late in the evening of October 5, 1976, Jimmy broke into the house of 70-year-old neighbor Alice Stock. Threatening with a knife, he forced her to undress. The woman was numb with fear and could not move or speak. Unable to get his way, Jimmy looked around for valuables. He, seeing the wallet on the cabinet, took all the money out of it and ran out of the house. Alice didn't call the police. She lived alone and was afraid that Jimmy would come to her again. The next day, Alice told her neighbor about what had happened the day before, and neighbor immediately called the police. Jimmy was arrested and sent to a juvenile correctional facility for 2 months. When he got home, he began to behave even worse. Jimmy found a new pastime: robbing houses. As victims, he chose elderly women who lived alone. For a long time, he managed to remain uncaught, although everyone in the area suspected that he was the one who committed the burglaries, but there was no evidence against him, so the police let him go every time. In August 1977, Jimmy still managed to be held accountable. His fingerprints were found in a house that had recently been robbed. During interrogation, Jimmy confessed to a number of burglaries. Since Jimmy was only 17 years old and was detained for a non-violent crime, the court could have resentenced him to a juvenile correctional facility, but did otherwise. Jimmy was sent to Indian River Prison for 3 years, where there were quite loyal conditions, and for good behavior, prisoners could have a significantly reduced sentence. Jimmy was released on November 13, 1979, 7 months ahead of schedule. His behavior hasn't changed at all. Just 2 weeks later, on November 29, elderly neighbor Alice Stock was found dead in the bedroom of her house. An examination showed that she had been beaten, raped, including with a foreign object, and strangled. Jimmy was under suspicion. After all, 3 years ago, he had already entered her house and forced her to undress. But there was no direct evidence against the guy. To this day, Alice's case remains unsolved. At the end of 1979, a tragedy occurred in the Rode family. Ricky, Jimmy's older brother, died in a car accident. Ex-stepmother, Stella, attended the funeral. Under the influence of feelings, she said that the wrong son died, but immediately regretted it because Jimmy heard it. Stella apologized to Jimmy and later, to make amends, gave him her old car. Jimmy accepted the gift, but didn't forgive Stella for the casually dropped phrase. In January 1980, he came to Stella, supposedly to talk about his dead brother. Stella let him into the house. After a short conversation, Jimmy attacked her, raped, and began to choke her. He said that he had dreamed about it for a long time. Stella managed to escape and close herself in the bathroom. Jimmy tried to force the door, but it didn't work, so he left. Stella called her ex-husband and told him what had happened. After talking, they decided not to call the police. Jimmy's probation has not yet ended and he could be put in jail for a long time. The punishment for the guy was exclusion from the family. He was kicked out of the house and cut off all ties. At that time, Jimmy was 19 years old. The only person he could go to was his mother. Jimmy went to her. His good behavior lasted only 1 month, after which he committed another crime. On April 12, Jimmy visited his maternal grandmother, 70-year-old Mattie Marino. After a few phrases, he attacked the woman, beat her, and then wanted to strangle her, but she began to beg Jimmy not to do this, and he stopped. Before leaving, Jimmy took all the money he found at grandmother's house and her checkbook. Mattie Marino called the police. Jimmy was arrested the same day. This time he was sentenced to 5 years in a general regime prison. For escape attempts, fights, carrying alcohol, and other violations, Jimmy was transferred from one correctional facility to another, so he didn't end up in Cross City. There, Jimmy sometimes helped clean up the kitchen and take out the trash. His boss was 59-year-old Gladys Dean. One evening while cleaning, Jimmy was left alone with Gladys. Having seized the moment, he attacked Gladys and tried to undress her, but he did not succeed, and he began to choke her. Fortunately, Gladys managed to break free and get the better of Jimmy. 2 months after this incident, Jimmy was transferred to Rayford Prison in Florida and added another 3 years to the original term. There he met his idol, Ted Bundy. They started talking and spent a lot of time together. Jimmy admired Ted and his creepy deeds. He listened with pleasure to his stories and enthusiastically told about his own crimes. The police believe that Jimmy learned a lot from Ted, which is why he could not be caught for so long. It was Ted who advised Jimmy to change his name, come up with a new past, start a family, and start leading a double life in order to continue to do his terrible deeds without unnecessary suspicion. So in 1986, Cesar Francesco Barone appeared. He chose this name for himself because he admired Italian gangsters. In July, through a newspaper, he met 32-year-old Kathy Scarborough, who lives in Seattle, Washington. Cesar introduced himself to her as an Italian from Milano, who was raised by a foster family and later moved to the United States. He said that he traveled a lot, studied foreign languages, and served in the Italian Special Forces. Kathy didn't know that Cesar was serving time in prison. He said that he was in the army. His stories were so convincing that Kathy didn't doubt their veracity for a second. They corresponded and called up for almost a year. Cesar was released in 1987. He received parole for good behavior. Before that, Cesar told Kathy that his contract was ending soon and he would be able to come to her. They met in April and almost immediately began to live together. A year later, they got married and moved to the city of Hillsboro, Oregon. Cesar didn't go well with work. During the year, he changed 6 places. Then Cesar decides to go to serve in the army. By that time, he had officially changed his name and received new documents. Upon entering the service, Cesar didn't tell about his criminal record, so he was accepted. The first time, he showed himself from the best side. He became a good shooter, received the parachutist badge and a military medic's license. In 1989, Cesar even participated in the operation to capture the dictator in Panama, Manuel Noriega. But Cesar could not hide his true nature for long. In 1990, he began to harass a female officer. After the investigation, the real name of Cesar and his dark past were revealed. He was fired from the army. A difficult period began in the Barone family. The relationship between Kathy and Cesar has never been perfect, but lately he has become more and more abusive towards his wife. In January 1991, Kathy gave birth to a son. Money was sorely lacking. Cesar could not stay at one place of work for a long time. He spent the longest time in a nursing home where he cared for the elderly. But later it turned out that he used the infirm condition of the patients for his own perverted purposes. When this became known to the management, Cesar was fired, but for some reason no charges were brought against him. Barone's marriage came to an end after Cesar stole a bank card from Kathy's mother and withdrew $3,000, and nobody reported to the police. Cesar promised to return the money, but a few weeks later the woman died. She was advanced in age and had health problems, so her death surprised no one and no autopsy was performed. It is possible that Cesar was involved in this. In 1992, Kathy and her child left her husband and filed for divorce. Cesar's hands were untied again, nothing more restrained him, and he continued to commit his atrocities. Cesar could have gone unpunished for a long time if he had not attacked Matilda Gardner, who identified him. While investigating the latest attacks, Detective O'Connell noticed that they bear similarities to the Martha Schmidt case. It turned out Cesar lived just a few blocks from the woman. During interrogation, he denied any involvement in Martha's death. When asked if he had any weapons, Cesar replied that he had several pistols. Detectives got a warrant to search the house where Cesar recently lived. He shared it with a friend named Hutchison. The search took place on March 5, 1993. In Cesar's room, police found a 9mm Browning pistol and 8.5-inch Reebok sneakers. The evidence was sent for examination, which confirmed that it was from this Browning that Martha's car was shot, and a trace of the same Reebok sneakers was found in Margaret's house. Unfortunately, the evidence obtained was not enough to link Cesar to the murder of Martha, because the fatal shot was fired from a .22 caliber pistol. Since Cesar admitted to owning several pistols, the detectives decided to research his house. But what was their surprise when they learned that the house had suddenly burned down? After a long interrogation, housemate Hutchison admitted that Cesar called him and ordered him to burn the house because there were things that could connect him to other crimes. Cesar was interrogated again, but he denied everything. To reveal the veil of secrecy to the detectives helped one of the prisoners, who communicated with the suspect. He was promised to reduce the term, and he told a lot of useful information. So it became known that Cesar left some weapons with his former girlfriends. The detectives tracked them down and were able to get several pistols, including 2 instances of the .22 caliber. After a series of examinations, it was possible to establish that Martha was shot from one of them and Chinti Woodman from the other. Since the shots were fired at close range, traces of blood remained in the barrels of the pistols. DNA tests helped find out who it belonged to. The prisoner who denounced Cesar also told the detectives a story about Chinti Woodman that he had personally heard from him. Chinti was kidnapped outside a bar in Portland. Cesar was with his buddy Leonard Darcel. The detectives tracked him down. It turned out that he is serving time in prison for theft. At first he refused to cooperate with the police, but later agreed to an interview. Darcel said that he and Cesar lured Chinti into a car and drove to a remote location. Cesar pulled her out of the car, beat and raped her, then he wanted to shoot her, but suddenly Darcel began to dissuade him and beg him to just leave Chinti on the highway. But Cesar ordered Darcel to return to the car and still shot the girl. The detectives now had solid evidence against Cesar Barone. He was able to face charges for 4 murders and 2 assaults. In February 1994, Cesar was sentenced to death, but since such sentences had not been enforced since 1962, for Cesar this meant that he would spend the rest of his life behind bars. Darcel also received a 20-year prison sentence for being an accessory to the kidnapping and murder of Chinti Woodman, while Cesar was already serving his sentence. The police managed to link him to another case. In January 1993, the body of 51-year-old Betty Williams was found in her own apartment in the city of Portland. Initially, her death was considered natural. She had a heart attack. But during the autopsy, it turned out that Betty was raped with a foreign object, during which her heart stopped from shock. Cesar Barone died in prison on December 24, 2009, at the age of 49. The cause was a cancerous tumor on the heart.